The negotiations over the fiscal cliff and the outcome of that really only solved part of the revenue problem of the federal government. The expenditure side of the equation was really left unaddressed. Now, under the expiring legislation, there's about $90 billion of tax cuts that come into force under what they call the sequester. And I'm sure that there will be negotiations to maintain some of that spending rather than to allow it to expire. So that's one issue. The second issue is whether or not this new Congress will authorize an extension of the debt ceiling, or whether they will again negotiate and leave things right down to the wire. And there is a third item, and that is that the budget itself has to be passed by March 27th. So all of these issues have to be negotiated between the administration and the Congress. If we step back for a moment and think about the bigger issue, the bigger question is really this. The US government spending has grown in recent years from roughly 19% of GDP to 24% of GDP, while revenues have declined from 18% of GDP to 15% of GDP. So that made for initially roughly a 9 or 10% budget deficit. That budget deficit has come in to about 7%, and the negotiations over the fiscal cliff are essentially a question of how quickly the US will close the budget deficit. My guess is that at the end of the day, from a roughly 7% budget deficit, we'll see that move to about 5.5%, which means that there is a 1.5% drag on GDP from the narrowing fiscal deficit. That's not very severe, but it is a drag, and it means that instead of growth being maybe 3%, it's going to be more like 1.5% to 2%. So I envisage these negotiations eventually being solved, but having a moderating effect on GDP growth during this year. The big picture outlook for the US economy is driven by the fact that consumers and financial institutions are still deleveraging from the housing and credit bubble that ended in 2008. Now, when people are deleveraging and repaying debt, that means that they have to put aside money which would normally be saved and invested, and some of that money is then used to repay the debt. So the overall spending growth rate in the US is less than it would normally be because of the debt repayment and balance sheet repair process. Now, I expect that process to continue all through 2013 into 2014 and maybe even 2015. The US is making progress on deleveraging, but it's not yet over. To counter that, the administration is running budget deficits to support the economy, and the Fed is keeping interest rates on the floor and doing quantitative easing. That is, it's buying about $85 billion worth of securities every month to expand its balance sheet and support the growth of credit in the economy. Those factors, I think, will continue in place, but they're not going to prevent the economy from growing at a subpar rate. They're needed to support the growth that we're getting, but we should not expect growth to be something like 3.5%, or even 4%, as it would have been in a previous recovery.